They found that all personnel involved acted in accordance with those policies, processes and procedures. Where there were no such procedures in place relevant to the circumstances that were confronted, the reviewer found that all officers acted professionally and with sound judgment. We had no firm intelligence that would say that this vessel had departed and was arriving at Christmas Island at that time. The first time the arrival was sighted was at about 5:40 a.m. on the morning of the 15th, when a Customs and Border Protection officer temporarily at the island sighted the vessel. At that time, the vessel was some 600 metres offshore and travelling under its own power. The second point I want to make is about where the Customs Border Protection Command vessels were at the time. These are illustrated up on the map. However, I want to point out there were two vessels at the time. One was the HMAS Peary, which was the response vessel for potential arrivals of CFs. Also at the island at that stage was the Customs vessel Triton. It was there because it was carrying some 108 passengers, people who had arrived at Ashmore Island over 1,000 nautical miles away. They had been were being transferred to Christmas Island. But because of the severe weather conditions, for 2 days, we had been unable to transfer them onto the island itself. So on that evening, given the operating tempo, crew fatigue, but importantly safety issues, the two vessels were to the east of the island, to the lee of the weather. In the case of the Triton, given it was loaded with over 108 passengers that had been at sea for some time, we still hadn't been able to get them to Christmas Island. That was obviously to the lee of the island, given the conditions there, waiting overnight in the hope that the weather conditions would alleviate and they would be able to transfer the people onto Christmas Island. In the case of the HMAS Peary, the very day before, they had intercepted an arrival, and that arrival had 11 passengers on board. They too had not been able to be transferred at Flying Fish Cove, so they'd moved down to the lee of the island, and after a long discussion with the island authorities were able, given the numbers, to transfer those people off. But importantly, the hulk of that arrival could not be destroyed, and it had to be held custody overnight. To be destroyed, it has to be taken out over 10 nautical miles, and at that time, in the conditions, that was impossible. So on the night before, you had the Peary to the lee of the weather on the east of the island, with custody of the hulk of a previous arrival, with a steaming party. None of these boats could be moored. They were all steaming in the conditions. And the hulk of the previous arrival had a steaming party of Navy personnel who overnight were keeping that under power, awaiting the morning conditions. So again, for safety and important reasons, and given the threat level, the vessels were to the east of the island, to the lee, when the tragedy occurred. At the time of first notification, as I mentioned, was 5:40, and at time when that was communicated to the Peary and the Triton agreed, given the Triton was much further south, had 108 passengers on board, Peary was the response vessel, that it would respond to what was then an arrival. At that time, and throughout this exercise, our officers faced a range of difficulties. At the very time that those discussions were occurring, the hulk of Civ 220 had suffered a steering problem and was starting to drift in uncharted waters with Navy personnel on board. So at that time, the decision was appropriately taken for RIB to be dispatched with an engineer out to the hulk of the previous arrival to ensure the safety of the officers on board and to repair that. Throughout this exercise, as I said, there were many challenges, which I guess you would expect when you see an unfolding event that starts with what seems to be another arrival and slowly but rapidly changes to a potential shipwreck and search and rescue exercise. At the first time that the vessels became aware that the situation was changing from just another arrival, the people receiving those communications at Operations Centre had also received communications coming from O calls that had been made to West Australian Police and were transferred through to our Operations Centre from AMSA. So at the time of first communication of the changing nature of this event, we were also dealing with potentially a second emerging tragedy, because the communication that came in talked about being somewhere between Ashmore and Christmas, near a beach and on fire. Facts that did not accord with the information that was available to us on the boat that was arriving at Christmas Island. So throughout this, our people were dealing with potentially with two tragedies. At the time that it became clear that the situation changing, the Peary was waking its company. It had started that on first notification, preparing the vessel to sail north, had turned north, and had launched the rib with the engineer to the hulk of the previous vessel. Knowing what was unfolding, the Peary then arranged for the rib to come back so that it would be available and steamed north to deal with the situation. Shortly after that, the Peary suffered some engine problems, which meant that speed was reduced for a few minutes. In response to that unfolding event, the Peary took the decision, the commanding officer took the decision to launch its ribs so that they could speed to the site of the unfolding tragedy. The weather played its part throughout in this, and the ribs and tenders had to be launched in conditions that were above normal operating procedures. But given the tragedy unfolding, decisions were taken to achieve that. At the time when the ribs arrived and started the rescue operation, the Peary and then the Triton subsequently arrived. However, they had to stand off from the island because of the treacherous conditions. And this was obviously introducing time for the ribs to be transferring people to those vessels. So the decision was taken to launch a life raft from the Triton to enable that as a staging point. The rescue continued to be undertaken in treacherous conditions with debris and kelp causing problems for all throughout. Based on that documented evidence of what occurred and the development of that narrative, the review then assessed the actions against established policies and procedures. And in it, the review noted that at all times officers followed and acted in accordance with policies, processes and procedures, and where, because of the extraordinary and rapidly changing nature of these events, there were not established policies and procedures, those officers acted appropriately and exercised good judgment, as I think will be evident from some of the narrative of events that I've mentioned to you.